Okay, everyone. It is 12 noon on Wednesday, January 10th. Um, my name is Monica Driggers, and I want to welcome you to Dam Busters 101. I'm the Senior Program Director for the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance. Welcome to the Dam Busters 101 series. It's a collaboration between the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance, the Charles River Watershed Association, and the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration. Our educational series offers basic information about dam removal to managers from municipalities and nonprofits that may be considering such projects in the future. Please note that the series is not intended to advocate for the removal of any particular dam or dams. We are presenting a total of 11 in-depth presentations by expert speakers on different dam removal topics. For the series topics and exact schedule, please visit the Mass Rivers Alliance website at www.massriversalliance.org. Today's webinar is on community engagement. Please mark your calendars for the next webinar on February 7th at noon. We'll be talking about assessing local impacts, both historic and Indigenous. A few important housekeeping items. First, this session is scheduled to end at 1 p.m. Second, please either put your questions in the Q&A function for Zoom at the bottom of your screen, which Mass River staff is tracking, or hold them until the last half hour's question and answer session. Thirdly, please put your name and affiliation in the chat. These webinars are being recorded. Recordings and any other webinar materials will be made available on the Mass Rivers website. Lastly, we ask that you please complete the evaluation survey that will be sent to you after the webinar. The evaluation really is very important to us as it's helping us improve and possibly expand the series. And now I'm delighted to introduce our three speakers, all of whom are from the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. Our first speaker is Samantha Woods, who has been the executive director for the North and South Rivers Watershed Association for the past 22 years and has worked to grow their dam removal and river restoration program to include 7 active dam removal and fish passage improvements projects today. To date, the organization has successfully removed 3 dams and 2 low-head weirs to reconnect the third Herring Brook, a tributary to the North River. Samantha will share her experiences around how community engagement works to move river restoration forward. Secondly, Becky Malmet is the River Restoration Coordinator at North and South Rivers. She is new to their team and to river restoration work, but not to environmental policy and water issues, as she has over 10 years of experience working in the field. Becky will share some of the key strategies she has used to engage the public with dam removal projects that are in different stages of development. Last but definitely not least, we have Alex Manfield with us. Alex is the watershed ecologist at North and South and is the Mass Bay's South Shore Regional Coordinator. He has a long history with dam removal as the former ecologist with the Jones River Watershed Association, where he successfully led the removal of multiple dams in that watershed. And he will also share his experience with engaging the community around dam removal. And with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam.
Thank you so much, Monica. Let me just bring up my slides. So I think we're a little unique in that there's multiple dams going on, dam removals in different time frames that we're going to talk about on the South Shore. So I guess the good news is I think you'll have a wealth of sort of exposure to all the experiences that we have had in dam removal and in community engagement, which, as far as I'm concerned, is really the biggest, one of the biggest things that any local watershed association or advocate for dam removal has to really think about is how do we get people to be supportive of these kinds of projects. And I'm going to share with you a case study of the third Herring Brook, which is a tributary to the North River in our watershed. It's about 5 miles long, and it has, I'm going to try to share with you this map, which I have. And I'm going to turn my phone off so people won't bother me. So whoops, I'm not quite sure how to make it work in this view. Hold on just a second. Maybe what I can do is share it this way. The map is very, elongated, but it is in PowerPoint, so hopefully you can see this, or maybe we could do it this way. So the Third Herring Brook is a tributary to the North River, and it extends 5 miles from the North River up to its headwaters at Jacobs Pond. It actually is the town boundary between the towns of Hanover and Norwell. So we have the joy of needing permits in 2 different communities. Many of our natural rivers are town boundaries. They were natural boundaries during the time when our towns were founded. So, many of our rivers are actually the demarcation between 2 towns, and that usually means that we have to go through both governments in order to get permits at the local level anyways, but for an overview of this particular river restoration project, there were 4 dams along the Third Herring Brook. The first one from the ocean and from the North River. This is about 10 miles from the ocean, and the North River is a tidal river. So the tide actually comes up right up to the base of what was this dam here at what was known as the Tack Factory Dam, owned by another nonprofit, so a privately owned dam, owned by a nonprofit, Cardinal Cushing Centers, which provide services for developmentally disabled people. And so, as you can imagine, had their own struggles and inherited, like many owners do, this dam when they acquired the property that they reside at. Moving upstream, we get to yet another dam owned by a private nonprofit, the YMCA. Many people, of course, are familiar with the YMCA. This is our local South Shore YMCA, and they owned a dam called the Mill Pond Dam. Upstream from that was another dam called the Peterson's Pond Dam. This actually happens to be right behind our own offices. So the actual watershed office abuts this dam. And the owner was the Hanover Mall. And so that was a private entity, commercial entity. And then there were 2 low head weirs that were put in place in the river back in the 70s when the mall was developed. So when the mall was developed, they actually filled in the brook and doglegged it around the parking lot. So that was in an era in about it was the late 60s, early 70s, just as Wetlands Protection Act was getting started. So it didn't have this, our wetlands and our rivers didn't have the same protections that they do now. And so they were, able to fill it in and move the channel. And then they, for some reason, put in these low head weirs. I read somewhere that they were going to be landscape features. Like, I think they were going to put, fountains behind this. I don't know. It was the 70s. And then as you move upstream, there's another dam that really is the headwaters to the Third Herring Brook at Jacobs Pond. And there's a road that goes over the dam. The dam is actually the road. It's Route 123, so it's a major state route. And this was a natural pond, but it was enlarged during the time that this was built. All of these dams were colonial era mill dams, originally used for and repurposed over multiple times, probably starting off originally as sawmills, grist mills in the early 1700s. And then as the Industrial Revolution took hold, were made, useful for tack factory, so tack making was big in this area. And so they, in about 1900, when the electricity came, these dams were sort of abandoned in place. They were all relatively small. None of them were particularly hazardous. But clearly we had noted for many, many years along the Third Herring Brook, as you can imagine, the namesake is the herring. We would see thousands of herring downstream of this first dam, no fish ladders whatsoever on any of them. So no fish passage, herring in the brook, stopped at this first dam, and 5 miles of main stem that was closed off to them with another 5 miles of tributaries, so about 10 miles altogether available if we could reconnect this stream to the ocean. So let me give you a timeline because this started a long time ago. Let me get back to my slideshow, and I think here now I can use it appropriately. So, as I mentioned, a long time ago, I began working at the organization in 2002. That's 22 years ago. Right the year before I started, the YMCA's dam, which is the second dam from the ocean, was showing signs of failure. And it was at that time that the YMCA was actually being built. And so their engineers like went out and did a survey and said, hey, you guys have got a failing dam. You probably want to maybe get rid of it or deal with it. And so they called us to come. And again, we're very close to this, proximate physically. Our offices are very proximate. And the previous director before me started this discussion. And this was before we had Division of Ecological Restoration. This was when we had Riverways, so the predecessor to Division of Ecological Restoration. And of course, dam removal was very, very young in its infancy. Throughout the Commonwealth and even throughout the nation. I think only a few dams had been removed at that point in the late 90s, maybe the one up in Maine. But it wasn't as commonplace as it was now. So this was kind of groundbreaking, if you will, to consider. And so we kind of charged ahead, not really knowing what we were getting into, quite frankly. And at the time, Riverways, I think, they wanted to start removing dams. And so we were actually one of their first pilot projects with the YMCA dam. And we worked with the Y to go through the process of permitting. But unfortunately, that dam was denied. That dam removal was denied at the local level by the Norwell Conservation Commission. So as I mentioned to you, the dam and the brook are the dividing line between the towns of Hanover and Norwell. Hanover's Conservation Commission approved the removal. Norwell's Conservation Commission denied. Now, they were heavily influenced by, there was about 5 abutting residents to the pond that were very, as you can imagine, not willing and not wanting to lose their pond. That's where their houses look out over. It was a small pond. It was only a few feet deep. It was eutrophying. It was not long for the world, but either way, the community members, the 4 or 5 residents that lived along that pond, were very vocal and attended the Conservation Commission meetings. And our Conservation Commission in Norwell at the time, there wasn't a lot of precedent for this. So they didn't understand when we said, we would be changing the land underwater to river, that there would be certainly a loss of wetlands, but it would be a change, not a loss, but a change of type of wetland. And they really felt like it was a loss. And they denied the permit. And the YMCA at that point, being a local nonprofit themselves, didn't really want to get into appealing it and having a battle. And there wasn't as much enforcement from Office of Dam Safety at the time. And while this actually was considered a hazardous dam, it wasn't clear what it would actually hurt if it failed. There are some wells downstream, but not clear that there was really any structures that would be in the way. So it languished, and we were so surprised. We had funding. We had gone to the downstream Cardinal Cushing, started a conversation with them because we realized that the herring would have to get through that dam first. that we would have to open that up first. And we had a public meeting at that time that totally blew up in our face. Like it was probably my second month of working there. And we just were naive. Naive about how territorial people would be and how upset they would be about the loss of something in their landscape. Um, and so, quite frankly, we took the next 5 years to kind of lick our wounds. We didn't have any project at that point. And we started to think about, well, how could we engage the community in a way that would illuminate for them the way it's illuminated for us that we have problems with these dams, and that one of the issues is the river herring. Um, Multiple streams in our watershed are dammed that are called herring brooks and don't have herring in them anymore, or have very reduced populations. So we started a river herring count in 2008, and then have proceeded to have one every year since then. In 2010, we had the breach of the YMCA dam finally during the storm. So we had a catalyst, if you will, occur. During this time, before that catalyst, we had been doing more meetings and doing more outreach. And of course, the state was moving forward with other dam removal, so it was more in the news. And then you can see, I just put this here because it is such a long project. I just wanted you to understand the scale of the time. So we have removed 3 dams and 2 low head weirs as of now, and we still are working to get fish up into the headwaters through a fish ladder project. So in 2010, we were able to get the YMCA dam out. In 2014, in 2014, we got the YMCA dam out. In 2017, 18, we were able to remove the one downstream. And then in 2020, 2021, we were able to take the Hanover Mall out. And just last year, the 2 low head weirs. So we've been making our way upstream, and we actually have seen herring moving upstream, which is really exciting. And we also have had brook trout in the stream now in the main stem. And so we were able to list this as a cold water fisheries resource, which gave it additional protection as the Hanover Mall was being redeveloped. Their stormwater had to come up to code for that. So again, just an overview of a long, lengthy project and kind of a story into itself. But back to the kind of community engagement. I mean, I think what we learned from all that was you can never have enough community engagement. Meetings with abutters, with conservation commissioners, singularly and together if you can, with owners. We kept these relationships going for years with the owners of these dams while things languished, just to be able to make sure that, they understood that we were still interested, that we would still be able to bring resources to the table, if and when they decided it was an opportunity to remove the dam. So just being prepared with your owners for the right time frame is really important. Talking to selectmen, I know selectmen and conservation commissioners change, as do abutters, but just continual outreach with these folks. And we even got to the point where people had changed their minds, and come around to our way of thinking. Showing the damage that dams do, I think that's more that citizen monitoring, having the public come out and help us count the fish and see that they couldn't get upstream was, I think, eye-opening. And people talk, so that helped. We did traditional mailing of a brochure to around the Third Herring Brook, to people within a certain circumference of the area. We made a film called "Let the Rivers Flow." That was sort of after, I think it was after both the Cardinal and the YMCA, and before we took out the Mall Dam. We had a tour as one of our New Year's. We do a New Year's Eve walk, a New Year's Day walk, and we did a tour of all of the different sites. So nothing speaks to people like going out and taking a look at things. We always shared stories of other watershed associations, successful dam removal stories. Imagery is really important for people. A picture's worth 1,000 words. So showing imagery of before and after dam removals, and using website and YouTube videos. This all really happened in the early stages before we had such things, quite frankly. And I think Becky will be able to share more with you about some of the technology that she's been using to speak with people. This is just the film. I won't share it with you. You guys can go and see it yourself because I want to give time to our other speakers. If I can get out of here, hold on just a second, and let Becky take over and kind of share another perspective of all the other dams that we've been working on. So Becky, do you want to? I can stop my share. Okay.
All right, thanks, Sam. So we don't have a ton of time. Really going to focus on a project that we're currently working on that's in the very early stages. So this is a project, it's actually 2 dam removal projects along the Indian Head River. And the Indian Head River is one of the major tributaries to the North River. And so let me share my screen. You can see this map here. It shows the 2 different dams. On Ludden's Ford Dam, that's the first dam up from the river on the Indian Head River. Both of these dams are publicly owned. This first one is owned, creates a border between Hanover and Pembroke. So those 2 towns jointly own this dam. And then further upstream, we have the State Street Dam, which creates a border between Hanson and Hanover. And those are the 2 dam owners. So we've got 3 dams, 2 dams, 3 towns, 1 project. So community engagement has been interesting, and we've been learning a lot. And I think we have learned a lot from previous experience. So I think one of the biggest things we learned was you can't start educating people too early. So one of our first outreach our strategies started about a year ago after we had finished some reconnaissance reports and before we were starting feasibility studies to really understand the potential for removing these 2 dams. And we did what we called kind of a Dams 101 presentation, just providing some general information to people about dam removals, river restoration. I would say one of the most effective slides I had was this one, which shows how many dams there are in Massachusetts. So 3,000 dams. And you could audibly hear people react to this slide because people don't really have a sense of what's going on throughout the state. And then talking about, how many of those dams are actually functional, still provide the service that they were built to provide. So many of these dams were built to support industries that no longer exist. And then we also talked about river benefits of dam removal to the river and to the health of the fish and the ecology and the habitats. And then we brought it down to a little more locally what these projects are that we're talking about, what next steps are. And we started by bringing these 2, we determined to be the relevant boards and committees in the town. So it was select boards, conservation commissions, planning boards, historical commissions, and open space was our focus. So it was a few months, lots of night meetings, presenting this information just to start a conversation and to get people we could reach up to a similar level. We also, a few months later, invited all of those decision makers or potential decision makers out for a site visit, as Sam mentioned, to not only get people to see the sites, because even though they're in their towns, I learned most of them hadn't been to these sites, but also get all 3 towns together to get members of all the select boards, especially in town managers together to start these conversations, because in essence, they'll be making these decisions together. So I did find that site visit to be incredibly effective as well to get people out there, as Sam mentioned. And then we also did this kind of Dams 101 presentation as a public information session that was done via Zoom after the board and committee meetings were completed. And before we announced that info session, we did some door knocking for the abutters. There aren't too many people who have property right on the river, but what we did is myself and a representative from the town went out to every house that had a view of the dam and the impoundment so that they could hear from us before they heard from anybody else what the project was, what we were trying to accomplish. And we could hear their concerns, so that we could try to address them where possible during this session. We found about 25% of the people open the door and talk to us on a Saturday morning. We're able to leave 1-pagers for everybody else. And we had some really great conversations, found there was a lot more support for this than we had maybe thought that there would be. People were excited about the fact that, bringing more wildlife to the area, understanding this background that this dam is no longer needed and it's really just disconnecting habitats. And they're excited about the idea of reconnecting the river. A lot of people who lived along this area really appreciated the environmental and ecological benefits, and we're happy to talk about potentially increasing those. We also learned a ton about the history of the area. Some of these people had lived in these houses for generations, and we're able to talk about, you know, them being moved from one side of the road to the other after the factories left. So it was very effective. A lot of these people have since come to our future information sessions and are involved in the conversation. Then when the feasibility study was completed this fall and winter, we did another large project update. And we wanted to invite residents from all 3 towns to join us. But we didn't want it to just be who we could reach through our network or who the towns could reach through their networks. Each town has a very different way of providing information to residents. So we had some grant funding and were able to send out a postcard mailer to every household in all 3 towns. So this postcard that was a little bit bigger than a regular postcard, kept it pretty simple, QR codes and maps, went to 16,000 households. And we weren't really sure how it was going to land. It landed around Thanksgiving because the session was in early December. And what we found was on the registration form, when we asked people to tell us how they heard about the session, about half the people found out about the session through the postcard mailer. And the majority of those people were new to the Watershed Association. So they never would have heard about it if we didn't do this mailer. So I think that was really successful. We had a really good turnout in early December to show people the results of the feasibility study. So that felt successful. And then the other thing we've done, and we started to do in the fall and through the winter, and we'll continue to do, is a social media campaign. So this was new for the organization. And again, we had grant funding to bring in some help to put this together. So it's hashtag Let Our Rivers Flow. We're doing it on Instagram and Facebook. And we cover all sorts of things. We cover kind of specific projects that are happening in these local watersheds. We look at, as Sam mentioned, previous dam removal projects that we can show pictures of. We've been able to show the mechanics of dam removals using old pictures and videos, as well as some general education around dam removal. So pros and cons, how many dams have been removed on the South Shore. So I would say this has been effective in that it's really, there have been a lot of conversations online as a result, a lot of comments, and we're really getting a good sense of what people are concerned about. You know, managing conversations on social media is tricky, right? And interesting and colorful. But it's a great way to reach a whole new group of people who the Watershed Association without this wouldn't have been able to reach. So as I mentioned, you know, we're still early in this process, in this dam removal process along the Indian Head River. So I guess the benefit of this outreach in terms of whether or not that people are going to support the dam removals, that remains to be seen. But in terms of engaging people, understanding what people's concerns are and being able to react to those and educate people, I would say it's already been wildly successful. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who's going to talk a little bit more about innovative techniques to educate people.
Thanks, Becky. Share my screen here. See my screen. Yeah, so I'm going to try to cover a little bit of territory that wasn't covered by Sam and Becky. This project, I'm talking about 2 projects that we did in Kingston, Mass on the Jones River. One about 12, 13 years ago, the Wapping Road Dam. So very early in the dam removal world. And so we didn't have as many lessons learned at that point. And the Elm Street Dam, also on the Jones River, that was about 5 years ago. The point I want to make here with the slide and talk about is the outreach that Sam and Becky both talked about includes a lot of different people. And so on these 2 dams, as you can see in this slide, we had, you know, in the case of Wapping Road, we had a private dam owner, a person who bought this building to start his small manufacturing business with no understanding at all about what means to have an old mill building with a dam connected to it and water flowing through a secondary channel right through his building. You can kind of see over the word owner in that picture. Upstream residential abutters, upstream agriculture, cranberry farm that could be impacted by dropping water levels. In the case of Elm Street, we had similar residential abutters who use the pond frequently. The dam being owned by the town water department, who had a long history of using that dam and an interest in keeping it. Across the river from them, a commercial wedding venue that used the backyard and the waterfall of the dam as their backdrop for a lot of photos, and had a real attachment to their business. Upstream open space where people use the pond for fishing, canoeing. There was an outlook deck there. And so the point of all this is to say that these are all people that we had to interact with and reach out to, and they didn't all need to hear the same message. They all had different interests in this, and we ended up learning that it was really important to try to figure out what they cared about, meet them where they're at, and discuss how the dam removal would impact them and how it could improve their homes or their businesses, and what those changes meant for the ecology and for them personally. We think of it as an environmental improvement project, as an ecology. We talk about fish and water quality. The guy who owns the wedding venue only cares about brides and mothers of brides. That's the only thing that's of interest to him. It's his business. The residential abutters, they care about keeping that pond that they've always seen. That they're cautious. They're concerned about all the things you can imagine. The dam owner, in the case of Wapping Road, he just wanted it to go away. And so it was a different message for each of these people. And I encourage everybody working on a project like this to think about those people's interests and not just your own, and find sort of the means to the end that is, meeting people where it works. I'm going to share too many slides here, but in the case of Wapping Road, one of the things we ended up doing, I'll make this story short, but it's an interesting one. The funders, NOAA and other funders that were willing to fund this project, wanted to see the property owner have some skin in the game and put some money into this. He was a guy running a small business. He didn't have money to worry about taking dams out and doing river restoration. We ended up doing a really innovative project to carve out, he owned a little bit of property, about a half an acre on the opposite side of the river, that we carved out, bought with town CPC funds, and put the proceeds of that sale back into the project as match for NOAA grants. So we ended up achieving this win-win by being creative and, seeking kind of what everybody needed from this, which was money from him, open space now available for the town to have, so people can access the river with canoes and kayaks, some historical signage there that wouldn't have been present on private property, and as well as construction access for us. So it was this win-win through long engagement with the property owner and the town. In the case of the Elm Street Dam, the wedding venue owners were dead set against doing this. They really loved this waterfall. It's not the best picture. I think at the time I was trying to take the worst picture of the dam, but it really was a beautiful spot for taking wedding pictures. And so we spent extra money on photo simulations for what it would look like when the dam was removed, so that he could see what he was getting. He could think about what he was working with. He could even advertise these photo simulations for upcoming weddings that he was booking while we were under construction. And I didn't want to share. We look at these photo simulations all the time. This is let's go back and forth between these pictures. That's the actual real post removal condition. That's an actual photo. This was our photo simulation. So, you know, we didn't, we weren't tricking anybody. We weren't overstating what was going to happen. And now he, you know, he continues to have successful business there. So that's all I have for slides. But just again, to reiterate that, you know, everybody is coming at this from a different angle, and finding out what is important to people is really critical to getting that support from so many different types of people.
Yeah, I totally couldn't agree more with you, Alex. And I just want to reiterate that Alex did this when he was with the Jones River Watershed Association. It was not the North and South or Mass Based
Right.
Project. It was really all kudos go to the Jones River Watershed for
Definitely.
that steadfast work and supporting Alex in that position to make it happen.
Yep.
But yeah, couldn't agree more that you can't force feed anybody anything. You need to share with people what you know, and then I think sort of humbly accept where they're at, and try to reassure them, provide them evidence, and take their concerns seriously, because they are real and affect them personally. And the more you can do that, I think it does take time for people to come around, but we found that approach, you know, does help. So I think we're ready for any questions, Anna or Monica. I'm not sure how you want to.
Yeah, I am your MC for questions, and we have a couple. Well, it looks like we now have 3 questions in the Q&A, and I encourage people to put more in. But I'm just going to start off with one question, because I'm struck that one of the themes through all of your presentations was that you have these people, as Alex was just explaining, who are really have different interests. So they're different cohorts. They're a property owner or a butter or etc. And I'm just wondering, how do you best engage those groups? Did you feel it was more productive to meet with them individually, or, you know, in some sort of group session? What seemed to work best with the different cohorts? And then we'll go on to the other questions.
Yeah, I'll answer that quick, because I was talking about different cohorts, but I know Becky's dealing with this right now too. We really did take a door knocking approach. We went to people individually. I mean, the town certainly is a different level where, you know, we ended up at town meeting. But even working with the water department there, I got on the agenda for the water department meetings. It was not, you know, the whole town. At that time, I was just talking to the individual guys who worked in that building next to the dam. We knocked on the doors of all the abutters and got to know them. And we went from people slamming the door in our face to people that I still stop by and have coffee with, to check out how the river's looking.
And I think it depends on where you are in the process, right? You know, in the very beginning, you kind of want to understand who has the biggest, most vested interests in the project and start there. And then you can kind of go out into larger and larger groups, and you can start to have these public meetings and public information sessions. And then, you know, we have a couple of other dam removal projects in the South River that are further along in permitting and fundraising. And there your reach goes even further. You know, we just did a whole bunch of posters and flyering for a public meeting for a final design for one of these projects. So it really depends on where you are, like I said, but really starting with those people who the project will have the biggest impact, I think, is where you start, and where you start the closest, and where you start the most direct outreach.
And knowing that you may not be able to convince some, you know, hopefully they'll come around, but it may not be that everybody will agree. And in that case, that's where bringing more of the public voice in, I think, can be helpful, particularly if, you know, for a town to make a decision if they're the owner.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, Sam. It's kind of like, who's going to be the decision maker as well. So, you know, with these publicly owned dams, you just want to provide as much information as possible to the people who are going to ultimately make this decision, so they can make a well-informed decision, right? So with the privately owned dams, it's a little bit different, a little bit smaller scale in that sense of how the decision is made. But you really want to, again, educate about the background of the project, in addition to just, here is the project and this is what it will look like and this is what the result is going to be. Why are we doing it? What do we want them? What do we want people? What kind of information do people need to have in order to make that decision?
I think too, just because you have to go through quite a bit of permitting to get
Mm.
these ultimately done. And if you've got a butters, they have a stake in it and can be much more influential in it, sort of delaying your project, making it cost more. So you really want to understand anybody who might have an ability to appeal or prevent you from doing the project. So you want to understand what their concerns are so that you, in your scoping of your engineering and your design, can try to address them so that you don't get caught up on that in a permitting process. I mean, you may still, but they may not be able to overcome the decision. So it's another real good reason. Even if they're adversarial, you want to know why.
Thank you for that. It was extremely helpful. I've got a couple of questions having to do with social media. The first is whether you used digital ads with the social media campaign. And the second is, did you use social media platforms other than Facebook?
So we didn't use true digital ads, but we do boost the posts, which gives you a broader reach. And it's considered a type of ad, but not as targeted as a true like meta ad would be. You did the post both on Facebook and on Instagram. So we use those two platforms.
Great, thank you. Okay. Third question is interesting. What advice do you have for dealing with people who accuse you of lying, or for dealing with the spread of disinformation generally?
Social media, it's very difficult to have like a nuanced conversation right in front of the public on a social media platform. Becky and I have been struggling with that since that has occurred on our Facebook page and or in other forums on social media. I think you try to provide some succinct and credible answers to the things that are justifiable questions, and then try not to engage too heavily, to go down some people want to fight, duke it out. I don't think that's the place for it. So we try to divert people to, can we have a conversation? Can you and I talk, rather than this social media kind of place? I mean, you can't control how people are going to behave. You can only control your own sort of communications. And I think for other audiences who are seeing that communication, they can see the people who might be taking the high road of discourse versus just kind of throwing stuff at a wall.
And I also think it's important to think about community engagement just in general. I mean, it's about building trust. It's about building relationships and partnerships, which is why a lot of the door knocking and the one-on-one conversations are really effective. Because, and to Alex's point that he still has coffee with some of these people who he worked on this project years ago. So the more you can build trust and build positive relationships, I think the more validity you have to the statements that you're making. And that's a big piece of it. A lot of it, this doesn't happen overnight. You know, the Watershed Association has been around for 20 years, or I'm sorry, since the 70s. So there's a lot of background and a lot of history there. And so even if you're with a newer organization, it's, you know, it's up to you to start to build that trust and establish those relationships as early as possible.
Yeah, I think one of the most effective things to counter disinformation or lies or accusations is to have other people that are not us who chime in on that conversation, right? So if we're having somebody making that accusation or something, then we have found other people getting on our, who are on the side of this, who have become educated through other means with us. They chime in and they're the ones countering that discourse. Even and that same thing can happen in a conservation commission meeting, right? So we try very hard to publicize to our members and even we sort of we have fans of dam removal, right? So we know who in our groups that we would reach out to personally when we're going to have a meeting to say, could you come to this meeting? We know that you care about this issue. We really could use you to attend and speak out in favor. And that could be a board member, that can be members, it could just be colleagues, but somebody external to you that might be seen as a credible external viewpoint. I think it's a really helpful thing because people will see you as coming with your agenda.
Yeah, I'll just add one last piece to all of that too, which is I think all of us who are working in this have good intentions, and we want everybody to be happy with our project. And there are going to be some people that you just don't reach and are unhappy with the final result, and it doesn't feel good, but it's the reality. And sometimes you have to let that go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, we have another, sorry, go ahead, Sam.
No, I was just gonna say, I think many of us view ourselves as the men in the white hats. We're the good guys, and I think it particularly provides us angst when somebody is not in our camp. But as Alex said, you can't please everybody all the time, and you can only do what you can to provide the education and hope that good decision making will follow.
Okay, we have a great question from John in Haverhill, and it actually piggybacks on a question I was going to ask. He's asking, can you speak a bit about opponents who sentimentally seem to believe and insist that removal of a dam will harm the existing wildlife and green growth? And I was actually going to ask Sam about the pond abutters who you were describing and what eventually won them over.
Well, let me just say, I don't think everybody was won over. I think they were resigned because they didn't own the particular infrastructure, right? And they weren't going to come up with the $1 million+ it would have taken to rebuild a dam. But then some people who did come around, it's like Becky said, it was years of us being kind, credible humans with them. And saying what we understand. We like ponds. We're not against a pond. It's just that this is supposed to be a river. And I mean, that can get even more complicated when we start talking about beavers using rivers and making impoundments. So you have to have some kind of relationship in order to have a more in-depth and nuanced discussion with people, and also sharing sometimes when you're not sure, like we're not, yeah. I just think to that point of, if you want somebody to listen to you, you have to listen to them.
And I think to the point of sharing when you don't have an answer, we've brought in experts from the state typically, or, Fish and Wildlife, to be on some of these public meetings and be part of these meetings and calls, so that when there are questions about exactly what you asked about, impacts of wildlife, impacts of the fish that live in that pond, that it's not us telling them, that we have experts who can tell them. And they don't always tell our story either. I mean, sometimes they will tell talk about the impacts of the fish that live in that pond and won't do well in a cold water, free flowing river, because that's also the reality. Those fish will need to find someplace else. But I think that's really helpful to bring in a team of experts beyond yourself to share. And I think people have really responded to that. And similarly, with presenting a study, to have the consultants provide a lot of that detailed technical information and work with consultants who are really good at communicating that type of information to the general population makes a very big difference.
Yeah.
There's another piece too about these changes. One of the things that we ran into at Wapping Road, same types of questions. This pond is here. We like the fish that are here. We like the birds that are here. We don't want to see that go away. And we started asking abutters who had lived there for 20, 30, 40 years if they could tell us if they'd noticed any changes over the time that they've lived there. And they started saying, yeah, it used to be more open and now there's some more vegetation, or we see different animals that come. We used to have ducks and now we don't, or things, and things have changed. And, it was sort of their own realization that these impoundments are unnatural and they're filling in. And so that the pond that you're thinking you're keeping is changing on its own. And so you're not going to be able to keep what you've had all along. And that, short of dredging impoundments, restoration is really the thing that will keep it a vibrant environment.
Yeah, and there's so many examples now of dam removal projects across the state that engaging, we brought in a select board member from Plymouth to talk to the select board members in Hanover, Hanson, and Pembroke to talk about what the experience actually was like, or bringing people to other sites where the dams have been removed so they can see what it really looks like. Very effective too.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that, again, it's not, ponds are an ecologically valuable landscape feature. It's just that a river's supposed to be a river, and free flowing water is one of the most endangered types of habitats in the world. Because that picture that Becky showed of the 3,000 dams, which is from the Division of Ecological Restoration, I'm sure they'd be happy to give it to you. Multiply that everywhere. If you looked at a map of the United States, it would be filled with dots. And if you look at the world, it's filled with dots. So there's really very few rivers that have not, that are free flowing anymore. And so the species that have evolved in those free flowing spaces are now become endangered or threatened. And so, I think that's another tool that I've tried to provide people, like to try to think about the landscape. I think people just think the landscape is the way it's been since they've been there, and trying to give them more of a historical perspective that, these dams have been there for 400 years, but this 10,000 years before that, it was a free-flowing stream. It may have had beavers on it. There may have been ephemeral impoundments. That's one of the things that, I've struggled with. Well, what happens when we get a beaver? Because we've had beavers come back in the areas where the dams have been removed. What do? We keep them? Are we letting them, or do we have to remove them? It's usually a site-by-site kind of case-by-case determination.
Thank you. Okay, so we're closing in on sort of the end of this awesome session. It's really been great. I think I have one last question from Anne. How have you addressed fears about increased flooding and/or the impacts of potentially releasing contaminated sediments due to dam removal?
I'm gonna let Becky answer that because she's got the most contaminated sediment problems.
Data, right? I mean, the goal is to design a dam removal project that's not going to impact infrastructure downstream as a result of flooding, right? So it's going to be a hard case to present a design that's going to impact infrastructure. I don't know that that would fly. So, working with good consultants, having reports that are relatable and readable and understandable, and visuals. Sediment's a whole different ball of wax. We're in the midst of dealing with that with the Indian Head River project. And I think with anything, it's giving people perspective and options and trusting you that you're getting the appropriate data to help them make the best decision. With contaminated sediment, there are a ton of different options of how you can manage it, depending on how much there is and how contaminated it is, how much funding you have. So I think it's a lot of education. There's a lot of fear around contaminated sediment. There's a lot of people really just understanding what's going on in their backyard and not understanding some larger, we're trying right now to give perspective of other case studies where dams have been removed, where the levels of contamination are higher or different or scarier, that it can be done and it has been done. We're in a good position now where there's lots of examples out there that can help people understand how it can work effectively. But yeah, really trying to figure out how to best communicate that technical data. What does it mean if you exceed this threshold at this level? What does it mean to have a remediation plan to a certain level? I think that's the biggest piece of it, is communicating to people and also understanding what they're concerned about with the sediment. Are they concerned it's going to affect the fish that are in there? Are they concerned that it's going to affect kids running around in the park? So that you can then tailor your communication to what their concerns are. But yeah, I mean, it's so much of that is really just based on data and studies and modeling. And the understanding in the beginning that those are concerns people are going to have, and you're going to have to say, we don't have the answer to that question, and we won't until we do X, Y, and Z. That's really fair.
So I guess we have about 5 minutes left, and a few more questions have rolled in. So I'm gonna just try to get a couple of these in, put them together. The first is, did you find people receptive or excited about increasing fish passage? Did people find it compelling enough to change their minds? The second one was about the threat of adverse property value effects, primarily residential, and how social media is used to build support around perhaps misinformation about those things. Is there data or have there been studies on that any of you have used to counter those types of accusations?
Well, I guess I'll try that last one because we had some abutters who that was their big concern on the Third Herring Brook. I feel like there was a study done about that tried to answer that question. And because this project's been going on for most of my adult life, I'm struggling to remember the study, but I know that there was something that some researchers, some sociology type researchers tried to do to look at how and if property values were impacted. And of course, I don't think the conclusion was that they were reduced, that there was free flowing water was, in these small impoundments. I mean, if you're on a lake with a dock, that's a different beast, that is a different beast. And a lot of times I think in some of these larger impoundments, that would be really hard because you'd have enough abutters to group together that they might financially decide it's in their best interest to take on the dam itself, to acquire and or do something. But most of these mill ponds are not that big and don't have that kind of recreational value. We did find a ton of hockey pucks. Skating is big here in the South Shore. Hockey is even bigger. And so, yeah, there was a lot of sadness over the loss of that skating opportunity. And yes, there was perception that their property values would go down, but I can tell you in Norwell, there isn't a property value going down in Norwell. Probably anywhere in Massachusetts, right? So I don't think I could try to see if I could find that report, but I don't have it at the top of my fingers here. What was the other question?
There was one about like whether the fish count, the herring counts, you think really affected people.
I think that helped the public.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's not the abutters as much as it is other people who you then become more engaged with, who are the people you call when you're like, hey, we've got a meeting and we need some advocates for this, so that to counter maybe some of the private interest. But there were some of the private abutters who we engaged them in counting. And in fact, in that Let the Rivers Flow movie, the mother and her two children who are in the movie are abutters, and they, they became convinced that the better ecological thing to do was to remove the dam. But I also would counter that with they didn't have another option, quite frankly. I mean, it was either let the dam fail eventually through just, age, or remove it and have a controlled removal. So.
Terrific. Thank you for that. We are at time. I want to once again thank Sam, Alex, and Becky for sharing all of this information with us. We're getting all these messages in the chat saying what a great job you've done, what an excellent and informative presentation. And of course, I agree. This kind of wisdom is just, you can't get it from people other than the people who've really experienced it for so long. So We really appreciate it. I want to remind everybody that the next webinar is on February 7th at noon. We'll be talking about actually a somewhat similar topic, assessing local impacts, both historic and indigenous. And this recording, plus some associated materials, will be up on the Mass Rivers Alliance website probably within the next week. So we encourage you to share the recorded webinar with everyone you can and to spread the word. Thank you so much to everybody for attending.